bana bana, sango sango, simba simba, tanda tanda, heo heo, baba ye, tika tika, samba ye, oh.
At its core, the transatlantic slave trade was triggered by a centuries-long clash between two powerful religious and cultural forces, Christianity and Islam. By tracing the origins of these systems, we can better understand not just how the trade began, but how its effects continue to shape our world today. The story of the trade did not begin with European ships on the African coast. It was shaped by centuries of global power struggles, religious conflicts, and economic transformations. The rise of Islamic empires, the Crusades, and the Reconquista of Spain and Portugal all played a role in shaping the ideological and economic systems that would later justify and sustain mass enslavement. Understanding this broader historical context is crucial because it explains how the groundwork for transatlantic slavery was laid long before the first enslaved Africans were taken to the Americas. An in-depth analysis of the institution of slavery and its nuances around the world is beyond the scope of this video. However, it is essential to give some attention to the subject. Before we deep dive into the transatlantic slave trade, let us first look back to a major turning point in human history that significantly influenced the increase in the global slave population. The 7th century experienced a dramatic shift with the emergence of Islamic civilization. During its golden age, Islamic civilization expanded in less than a century, from the Arabian Peninsula to Spain and India, transforming vast regions through a complete cultural and linguistic metamorphosis that revolutionized trade, science, and art, while inheriting all the wisdom of the ancient world and establishing itself as arguably the greatest civilization the world had ever seen for the next 1,000 years. By the 10th century, the Islamic caliphates began their gradual decline. Yet, even during this period, known as the Islamic Golden Age, the world witnessed unparalleled advancements in science, medicine, philosophy, and the arts. Cities like Baghdad and Cordoba became beacons of knowledge, attracting scholars from across the globe. But beneath the surface, something more dark and sinister was taking place. With the expansion of Islamic empires, the demand for slaves surged and involved the enslavement of people from diverse regions, including Africa, Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. It is estimated that between 10 to 15 million souls were sold into slavery over the course of 1,000 years. The majority of these slaves were women, who became concubines and household servants, a stark contrast to the Atlantic slave trade, where 2/3 of the enslaved were men forced into plantation labor. Estimates suggest that around 65 to 75% of the individuals enslaved in the Arab Islamic slave trade were African. In early Islam, Caliph Umar decreed several rights for concubines who bore children. A concubine could not be separated from her child or sold. Her child would be considered free and legally equal to the children born to the master's wife, and at the death of her master, she would be freed. These rules had a tremendous impact on the nature of slavery in the Muslim world. Children born to slaves often rose to leadership positions within their families and communities. According to one estimate, 34 out of 37 rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate were born to slave mothers. Male slaves also played a significant role in Islamic societies. The Mamluk soldiers, enslaved from Central Asia and the Caucasus, became a powerful military class, while others served in domestic roles. In the 7th century, the world's population was approximately 200 million people. As societies grew, so did their demand for labor, a demand often met through slavery. With the expansion of Islamic empires, the demand for slaves surged, and the trade routes connecting Africa, Arabia, and beyond became conduits for human suffering. When Europeans began exploring and colonizing the Americas, they only had to plug into the existing system of slavery, which was already primed for rapid mass exportation of people. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas, was built on the foundations laid by centuries of Islamic slave trading. By the 11th century, the once mighty Abbasid Caliphate had fragmented, leaving the Islamic world divided among regional powers. In Asia, the Seljuk Turks emerged as a dominant force, while in Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate held sway. This political fragmentation made the region vulnerable to outside attacks. Meanwhile, the Christian Crusaders launched a series of wars to seize holy sites from Muslim control. In 1198, they stunned the Islamic world by seizing Jerusalem. These conflicts were driven largely by religion, as European Christians viewed the conquest and enslavement of non-Christians as a divine act, a way to bring the word of God to the infidels. To the Crusaders, warring against non-Christians was a service to God. Since the 8th century, Islamic societies had established themselves as a dominant force. In 711 CE, Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, which they called Al-Andalus. For centuries, Al-Andalus flourished as a center of learning and culture. Centuries later, Christian kingdoms in the north began a 400-year crusade to seize the land, a period known as the Reconquista. By the 11th century, Europe was emerging from a period of fragmentation and decline that had followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Once a collection of warring kingdoms, Europe was now increasingly unified under Christianity, with the Pope serving as its spiritual leader and a key political influencer. Throughout history, religion has been used to justify war, conquest, and slavery. But the European approach to religious war wasn't entirely original. Instead, it was shaped by centuries of contact with the Islamic world. From the Crusades to the Reconquista, European rulers observed, fought against, and ultimately adopted elements of Islamic jihad, twisting it to serve their own purposes. Jihad in Islam meant struggle in the path of God. It had both a spiritual and military meaning. In war, it was structured around three options for non-Muslims. 1. Convert to Islam. 2. Accept Islamic rule and pay a tax, jizya. Or 3. Resist and face war, death, or enslavement. For centuries, Muslim rulers used this framework in the expansion of Islamic empires. Prisoners of war were enslaved, but they were not permanently bound to servitude. Many could earn their freedom, and some, like the Mamluks of Egypt and the Ottoman Janissaries, even rose to power. But when Christian Europe borrowed this model, they made one crucial change. Slavery was no longer temporary. It became permanent and racialized. During the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of Spain from Muslim rule, Catholic monarchs repurposed jihad into their own version of holy war. Muslim and Jewish populations were given the same three choices. 1. Convert to Christianity. 2. Accept Christian rule and be taxed. And 3. Resist and face war or enslavement. The Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal absorbed military strategies, financial systems, and even slave trading models from the Islamic world. They fought like their Muslim counterparts, but applied an even harsher doctrine. By the 15th century, the Catholic Church took it one step further. The papal bulls of 1452 and 1455, issued by Pope Nicholas V, explicitly authorized Spain and Portugal to enslave non-Christians. This religious justification merged with economic ambition, leading directly to the transatlantic slave trade. But unlike in Islamic societies, where slaves could be freed and integrated, European slavery was permanent, hereditary, and tied to race. The logic of religious war had evolved into something new, a system where people were no longer enslaved because of conquest alone, but because of the color of their skin. The transatlantic slave trade did not emerge in isolation. It was the product of centuries of religious war, conquest, and adaptation. It was the result of European powers taking the jihad model of war and enslavement and transforming it into a global system of racial exploitation. The foundation had been laid. What began as a struggle over faith had become something much larger, a global empire built on the backs of the enslaved. By the year 1200 CE, the Islamic world had reached the twilight of its golden age. For centuries, it had been a beacon of knowledge, culture, and power, with cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba standing as centers of learning and innovation. Yet the winds of change were blowing. The Crusades, which had begun over a century earlier, had exposed Europe to the wealth and wisdom of the Islamic world, sparking a period of transformation in the West. After 400 years of conflict, the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal finally completed the Reconquista in 1492 with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. This victory marked the end of Muslim rule in Spain and the beginning of a new era of European expansion. After at least 7 failed attempts over 200 years to capture the Holy Land, 2 major events shifted European focus away from the East toward the New World. First, the rise of the Ottoman Empire cut off the overland route through the Middle East that linked the lucrative Far East spice trade to the West. Second, after 400 years of continuous religious war, 2 new empires emerged from the ashes of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, united under Christianity and driven by a hunger for wealth and power. But first, they turned inward. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, sought to purify their kingdoms by targeting Jews and Muslims. In 1492, the same year Spain completed its Reconquista with the fall of Granada. The Alhambra decree ordered all Jews to convert or leave. Tens of thousands were expelled, while those who stayed faced relentless persecution as conversos. Muslims, forced to convert and known as Moriscos, met a similar fate, culminating in their expulsion a century later. With the blessing of the Pope, Spain and Portugal embarked on a mission to conquer and colonize. At the dawn of the Age of Exploration, Spain and Portugal stood unrivaled. Backed by the Catholic Church, these 2 Iberian powers justified their expansion. In 1492, the same year Spain completed its Reconquista, Christopher Columbus sailed westward, opening the door to the New World. As Spain and Portugal established their dominance over the Atlantic and beyond, a major agreement shaped the trajectory of European colonialism. In 1494, under the mediation of Pope Alexander VI, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe along an imaginary line roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain was granted dominion over most of the Americas, while Portugal was awarded territories in Africa, Asia, and what would later become Brazil. This papal decree not only formalized Spain and Portugal's spheres of influence, but also laid the groundwork for the rapid expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. With Portuguese control over African coastal territories and Brazil, they had direct access to both the supply and demand for enslaved labor. Meanwhile, Spain's vast empire in the Americas created an insatiable need for labor, fueling the mass forced migration of Africans across the Atlantic. This treaty ensured that, for nearly a century, Spain and Portugal remained the unrivaled superpowers in global trade, including the human trafficking networks that would define the transatlantic slave trade. However, this dominance would not go unchallenged. Soon, European powers would take turns dominating this brutal trade, each leaving their mark on the lives of enslaved Africans and the economies of the New World. The transatlantic slave trade did not emerge in a vacuum. It was built upon centuries of economic ambition, religious justification, and systemic exploitation. By understanding these foundations, we gain insight into how human lives were commodified, how entire societies were reshaped, and how the echoes of this history still reverberate today. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the past. See you in the next video.
Bana bana, sango sango, simba simba.